I tell you? First, for those of you who are new to Bigelow, Bigelow is an independent, nonprofit research institution. And most of our funding and revenues come from federal grants to support basic science research and some applied research. But another significant part of our revenue comes from private donations. And so I want to take this opportunity to thank any of our audience members who donate to the lab for your support. That support makes evenings and events such as this really possible. So thank you, and thank you for coming to tonight. Most of our themes for our Café Scientifique series this summer are related to our new Centers for Venture Research. So we've started these two centers about 7 months ago. And we have one on seafood security and one on the opening Arctic Ocean. And so tonight, obviously, Mike Lomas is going to talk about the Arctic. And actually, I want to advertise next week's speaker, because that speaker is me. And I will also be speaking about research in the Arctic. And then we have speakers, for example, last week and in coming weeks, who are talking about the work we're doing here, looking at seafood security and how aquaculture and other activities at Bigelow can support sort of a sustainable and healthy seafood source for Maine and for the country. So I encourage you to come to the coming weeks if you're interested in those topics. So Mike Lomas is our speaker tonight. Mike has been here, I think, since 2012. Yes. Mike got his bachelor's degree in marine chemistry and marine biology, overachiever, from Long Island University on Long Island, and then went on to do a PhD at the University of Maryland at Horn Point, looking at nitrogen cycling. And maybe you're going to talk about some nitrogen cycling today. Maybe, if you're lucky. And then did a postdoc also at Horn Point, and then went to Bermuda, to the Bermuda Institute for Ocean Sciences, or BIOS, not to be confused with BLOS, which is us, and was there for maybe 8 or 10 years, 12 years, quite a while. And in that time, Mike took over or became involved in one of the longest serving US time series of open ocean sites. It's called the BAT sites, or the Bermuda Atlantic Time Series. And Mike continues to be involved in that. And that's sort of one part of Mike's research, is tropical or subtropical warm water ecosystems and the role that phytoplankton play in the biogeochemistry of that. And then Mike has another side, which we're going to hear about tonight, which is in cold places. And so Mike's been involved in a number of projects in the Arctic, looking again at the role that phytoplankton, the microbes that many of folks here study, and the roles that they play in ecosystems and in biogeochemistry of the Arctic. So with that, I'll let Mike take it away, and thanks for coming. Oh.
You. How's this? Is this all right up there, guys? Awesome. So, thank you, Ben, for that wonderful introduction. I will echo the not asking hard questions. It's been a long day. But in all honesty, ask away. There'll be a sort of a middle break as we switch from physics to biology. So in case any questions come up, we won't want to confuse fields. So as Ben said, part of my research program is looking at polar regions. And so this particular talk, we're going to talk about a subarctic region. That's the Bering Sea. Show of hands, who's seen Deadliest Catch or some other Discovery Channel documentary on the Bering Sea? So everybody knows where it is. Excellent. So we're going to talk about a project that went on in the Bering Sea for about 6 years that I was involved with for the entire time, both as a scientist, actually conducting some of the measurements, the phytoplankton, primary production, lower trophic level measurements, as well as a member of their scientific advisory board, so one of the 6 people that was charged with riding herd over the 100 or so PIs, each with 1,000 opinions. So the talk tonight is going to basically try to give an overview of that entire program, because it's kind of interesting when we think about a simple parameter, in this case temperature. Not everything in the system behaves the same way to changes in temperature. Some things go up, some things go down. And so when we try to ask what seem like benign questions like, how does the Bering Sea respond to climate change, it really matters what part of the ecosystem you're talking about, even what part of the actual Bering Sea you're talking about. And so that's why I want to take and sort of give this broad overview and not dive too deeply into much of any of the trophic levels, but we can do that during questions. So, sort of set the stage for this project, only because these numbers are mind-numbing. The total project, we were out to sea for 4 years. There was a total of about 24,000 person days. If you actually divide that by 365, that's 66 years worth of field work embodied in 4 years, so we were rather busy. It was a unique partnership between the National Science Foundation and the North Pacific Research Board, so two bodies with an interest in funding science in that area. The whole program had an overall supported science value of about $50 million plus or minus, with some additional in-kind support from some of the other federal agencies. And as I said, there was about 100 principal investigators, each with way too many opinions, lots of institutions, small armies of graduates, students, technicians, field and ships crews. So a very large body of people and work that got done over 6 years. This is the ship that we were on for most of those cruises. This is the U.S. Coast Guard icebreaker Healy. A wonderful ship, about 420 feet long. First thing they do when you get on is they give you a pager so they can find you. So, for those who didn't raise their hand of where is the Bering Sea, we'll assume that you know, but you're going to see in a minute. But we're also going to take the first few slides and tell you about why it's actually important. And so the Bering Sea is right here. It sits into a western part close to Russia and an eastern part close to the US. And this is a map of the maximum seasonal sea ice exchange in the Arctic. So next week, where's Ben? Ben will talk about a trip from about here up to the Arctic. But the Bering Sea actually gets ice that blows out of the Arctic into its shelf in a seasonal pattern. And so we do have ice part of the year there. Another part of the reason why it's important, just the U.S. eastern side of the Bering Sea is bigger than California, so that's kind of big. The coastline, so all of the Alaskan coastline from Juneau down here all the way around the Aleutian Arc, all the way up here to Canada, is 2/3 of the entire U.S. coastline. So there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of systems. There's a lot of interactions that may happen. There's a lot of rivers coming in, both to the north side, the north slope, as well as on the eastern side. And so the dynamics of the system are actually rather exhilarating for those who may have been up there. There's also an amazing amount of biodiversity. These are just some of the interesting charismatic megafauna that one might see. Just as a little side tale, in 2010, I had to get off the cruise to make it back here for the birth of my son or get divorced, one of the two. So I made it back in time, but they dropped me off at a little island called St. Paul. There's actually more species of seabirds on the island of St. Paul than there are permanent inhabitants, just as an example of the diversity of organisms that live in this region. It also has an amazing commercial and traditional heritage value. The fisheries landings in this Bering Sea, in our part of the Bering Sea, exceed 200 million metric tons per year. That's more than the combined weight of every registered car and commercial vehicle in the state of Maine. I looked it up on the DMV site last night. Pretty interesting. It accounts for roughly half of the U.S. total national fisheries landings. So half of the things you might eat actually come out of the Bering Sea. It accounts for thousands of jobs that support those fisheries, but it also supports tens of thousands of native peoples that live all around that shoreline. There's something on the order of like 55 to 60,000 native Alaskan peoples that live there that rely on the Bering Sea for their livelihood. And the fisheries account for roughly half of the Alaskan exports. Obviously, the other half is oil. For now. So how does all that diversity, how does all that productivity, how does all of that actually work through the Bering Sea? And it works because there's this amazing food web sitting underlying all of that. I had heard someone in the front asking what a food web is. A food web is this big thing that scientists use to draw lots of arrows and boxes that connect everything to everything else. Might refer to them as a spaghetti diagram. But to understand what happens in any one of these boxes within the ecosystem, you really have to understand every arrow that goes into it, which is why my opening comment was you can't just ask a fairly benign question because the answer is incredibly complicated. And so you need to be very careful about how you try to answer it. And therefore, the science programs need to be very all-encompassing. And so up until about the early 2000s, we thought we understood the Bering Sea from a temperature point of view. We thought that there was a nice, clean annual cycle. You know, the sea ice would come in, things would cool off, the sun would come up a little bit more, it would warm, the ice would melt back, it'd get a little bit warmer. And that's what we see here from, on this data record anyway, from 1995 to about 2000. This nice cyclic periodicity at a mooring right about here off Bristol Bay. But then starting in 2000, something strange happened. All of a sudden, the system got warm, and it never really got cold again. This blue line here is a 2-degree isotherm, and that will become important in a minute. That sort of defines a thermal threshold for a lot of the fisheries in that fish species in that region. And it never got below it, really. It still had this periodicity, but it never got below it. And so it's interesting to point out that during this time, everybody got concerned, so we started to conceive the Bering Sea program. We started to get the right people involved, the right interest, get the funding in place from the federal agencies. As soon as we got the funding, look what happens. See, this is the solution to everything. Put money at it. As soon as you put money at it, it starts to get cold again. And so the idea was we were going to compare cold and warm because we had a bunch of earlier projects out here in cold years. This was supposed to continue because that was climate change. Well, no, it got cold, so we got a bunch more cold data. So we're still stuck with this question of what's cold and warm in terms of how the system functions. But we've got some data that might suggest how that temperature fluctuation in terms of this shift from annual periodicity to multiple years of warm to multiple years of cold, how that stanza effect might actually ripple through the system. And so obviously the question is this new? Was this we just weren't looking long or hard enough? And so this is data from this tiny little island. This is St. Paul. This is where they kicked me off. But this is a 80-year record. The long-term running mean is in the blue line. And you can see where there's a red box, it's warmer than average, and a blue box, it's colder than average. So this is the period I just showed you. It's happened in the past. It's not regular. There doesn't seem to be any hidden magic to when it comes or goes. But at least the system has been colder and warmer than average before. So we don't have data this far back, really. So we're just going to focus here. But let's think about what that means. One, that's not a new pattern. But two, the intervening years between when it happened in the past and even when it happened up into the present are actually highly variable. So it goes from truly what are stanzas of warm or cold to a lot of chaotic variability, stanzas, lots of chaotic variability. And so what does that mean for biology in the ecosystem? Well, part of what it's going to mean for the biology in the ecosystem is that this warm and cold dictates just how far south and east that ice edge comes, that seasonal ice edge comes. And so all of the darker colored lines, the blue, the purple, the red, and the orange, those are all cold years. So it comes much farther south. The green line is 2001, which is one of those warm years. It doesn't come anywhere near as far south. And so if you actually add up all of the area between these pairs of lines, it's actually a very, very large amount of area. It's about half the size of California. So what does that mean? Well, what that ice, when it comes and goes below it, actually it cools. Sorry, I'm going to get out of my box. It gets colder. And so I've tried to keep all the graphs, or at least most of the graphs, these color pictures, because it makes it a little bit easier to see. Blue is cold, red is warm. When the water is warm, you still got cold water. This is that 2-degree water, or 0 to 2 degree water, but it stays north. When the ice or the system is cold and the ice extends further south, it goes all the way down to the Aleutian Arc. And so this blue region is what we've coined the cold pool. And so that cold pool sits on the bottom of the right at the benthic interface on the shelf, and it expands as the ice comes and goes in these periods of warm and cold. And as you'll see in a little bit, that controls where organisms are actually allowed to interact, because some species have thermal tolerances that don't actually allow them to enter that cold pool. So that's the end of physics. Are there any questions before we hop into biology, which is really what I know something about?
I noticed that when it gets cold in a hurry.
Yes.
Why is that?
So part of the reason it gets cold in a hurry is that the winds actually blow all the ice out of the Arctic. And so you've actually got basically all that cold thermal mass that's cooling off the winds, and it just literally blows a ton of cold air down. And so the sea ice will actually form very, very quickly.
Why is it warmer closer to the shore?
Because everybody in their motorboats. No. Because, do you really want me to answer that, Patty? I can. Yes, so it's because you have a lot of terrestrial inputs, all right? So you have rivers coming in, you have up here, you have Bristol Bay into these coves, and so you've actually got this underneath all the snow and the ice, you've actually got the land, and that actually does retain some heat, right? Who has geothermal heating? Right? So you actually have heat source close to the shallow waters, and the shelf gets out fairly quick, and then the only thing that influences the sea ice and all that cold water that actually comes from the south.
I saw that there were these different chemicals change how hot or cold the water is. So how do the chemicals get there that change the temperatures?
Right. So, sure. So the question was, chemistry of the water has an impact on the temperature. And so really the chemicals are really the salinities, right? So it's the salt content. And so the more salt you have in the water, the colder it can get before it changes its phase, before it actually starts to freeze to ice. And then so fresh water, this is why ponds actually freeze from the top as opposed to the bottom. So fresh water will freeze at the top, and all the slightly more salty, colder, denser water will sit at the bottom. Whereas in the Bering Sea, again, that fresh water at 0 degrees will freeze at the top, and you've got all that -2 degrees cold, salty water down below that won't freeze. All right, so let's head on to biology. So we're going to start at the bottom of the trophic, the food web connections. As Ben alluded to in the introduction, I'm a phytoplankton person. I study the single-cell plants that function in the ocean, and whether they grow on the bottom of ice, whether they grow in the water column, what their role they play. And so a very important type of algae or phytoplankton in the ocean, in the Bering Sea, are what we call sea ice algae. And so this is actually a piece of the seasonal sea ice that got flipped over as the ship was breaking through it. And all of this brown color isn't actually mud. This is actually phytoplankton and sea ice algae living on the bottom. And this is another piece that didn't get quite flipped all the way over. And so you can see these lines sitting here, almost like stratigraphy in geology. Whereas, you'll get the sea ice algae growing in, and then maybe it'll get really cold, and you'll get a little bit more ice forming below them, and it physically will trap them in the ice in a layer. The interesting thing about this sea ice algae is that it actually gets orders of magnitude higher on a per volume basis than the phytoplankton in seawater. So the amount of material is amazingly concentrated, and this becomes really, really important for getting that carbon that's tied up in them and the energy that's tied up into them into fish. The other interesting part is this is work from colleagues where they've taken and gone around the Arctic and into the Bering Sea to look to see where and what the concentrations are of sea ice algae. And actually in this Bering Sea, in the northern Bering Sea region, is where we find those highest concentrations so far of sea ice algae, suggesting not just, one, that they're higher in the sea ice than in the water on a volume basis, but anywhere in the Arctic, there's just this concentration of material that can ultimately flow up the food web to higher trophic levels. So when that material, when that algae starts to grow, it can actually form these long little filaments. So you have the initial algae growing as a layer, and they can't go up through the ice very well, so they grow down, and they start to form all these little strings right here. And it's their physiology and their compounds they produce that sort of stick them together like glue. And when the ice melts back, they're very heavy, and what they do is they sink to the bottom, and then you can create what's this layer of called phytodetritus sitting right on top of the benthos. It's all this flocculated phytoplankton that just quite literally fell to the bottom like a rock. As that material falls to the bottom, it gets consumed by all of the organisms living in the benthos, in the mud. These brittle stars and clams and worms and things like that. So there's an amazing biology that lives in the mud, fueled entirely by the fact that ice algae grow, get sticky, and sink to the bottom. Ice algae also seem to be the seed for what happens in the water column once the ice melts back. And so this is a false color image from one of the cruises that were out here. The ship is not really this big, but it makes it easier to see. All of this red, this is all a massive phytoplankton bloom. So imagine all of this algae now just almost homogeneously distributed through the water column. It'll be distributed through about 10 meters, so deeper than our ceiling is, and over that entire range of at the edge of the Bering Sea. And so while the ice algae are really, really important because they're concentrated, their presence in the system is short-lived, and so they think of them as sort of like a jump start, right? They're getting the system started, but really it's the phytoplankton that grow in the water column that keep the whole system running for the rest of the year. And so, because the title of the talk was, well, how does temperature ripple through a system, I wanted to, where we could, point out how big the changes are in certain parts of the ecosystem between warm and cold scenarios. And so one thing we can do is we can take and we can look at these color images of how much phytoplankton there are in the water, and we can make some guesstimates of how much light they're getting, how long the day is, and a temperature-dependent physiology term, and we can calculate how much material they're moving. And we can do that anytime we have an image, whether it's warm or whether it's cold. And so one of the things that our project did is we actually tried to look at, because we didn't have warm data, but go back to warm times in that early 2000s where we had satellite imagery, where we could take and calculate the amount of material being produced, compare it to the amount of material produced in the cold, and compare them to. And what we find is that relative to the cold period, there's about a 40–50% increase in the amount of phytoplankton produced in the water column when it's warm. And that's an important number to remember, 40 to 50, because when I get to some of the other numbers, you'll notice they're a lot larger, and that's actually a very, very important point. So once you have your phytoplankton going on, what happens next? When we have copepods, the copepods will come in, and there actually is what the fish feed on, that copepods and euphausids. So phytoplankton start the energy moving through the food web, copepods keep it going. Interestingly, we had some survey data from the warm years and the cold years, and if you follow this orange line, which are the large types of copepods that actually are the food stocks for the fish, the pollock fishery in the Bering Sea, they're very low and they just radically take off once the water gets cold. This equates to about a 300 to 400% increase in their biomass. So just going from one level to the next amplifies that temperature effect between warm and cold periods. Part of the reason why we think there's that amplification is because these guys aren't just feeding on phytoplankton, they're feeding on all these other really, really neat mixotrophic organisms, little ciliates and protists and things of that nature. And this is a total group of organisms that we largely ignored in the Arctic, except for, I don't know, maybe 3 people, and they've finally won the battle, and everyone's paying attention to them now. But they were thought to really not play an important role, and they actually probably play a hugely important role that we've just underestimated for a very long time. The next trophic link where that energy flows to are what's called euphausids, or krill. And again, this is a color map, and really what you need to see is red is a lot of organisms, blue is a little bit of organism biomass. When the water's cold, nearly the entire shelf is covered with euphausids. A huge amount of food to feed whales and seals and everything that charismatic megafauna. And here's actually an interesting image of the krill up on the bottom of the ice. So this isn't them down. This is actually them up on the bottom of the sea ice eating that sea ice algae. And this is probably why you're allowed to get so much biomass so early, is because they can go and they can feed on this very, very concentrated food source, jumpstart their reproductive cycle for the year, actually maybe get through 1.5 cycles, and actually really amplify the biomass very, very quickly. So that's the energy going up. Now let's think about what the fish do, right? Because we have to think about both sides of the coin here. And so remember I said to remember that 2-degree temperature line? Interestingly, 2 degrees seems to be a temperature threshold where young pollock can't actually cross very well, and the adult pollock won't cross at all. And so wherever you had that cold pool that grew and shrank as the ice grew and shrank, that actually provides a refuge for the euphausids because their predators can't get them. Those predators can't handle well that thermal stress. But when we look at our warm periods where the water doesn't really get that cold anymore, all of a sudden the pollock can grow everywhere where the euphausids do, and now you've got basically a food chain, right? Those pollock are chomping down on the euphausids, and that keeps that biomass under control. And so here's another point where that subtlety of temperature has a big impact on how energy flows through the ecosystem. Interestingly, when we take and look at pollock themselves, even though when they're in warm water and they're growing fast, they're actually of very poor quality. And what I mean by that is if you look at their actual energy content, so if you look at me, I've got a lot of energy content, okay? Much to my wife's chagrin. So I would be up here in the cold part of the world. These guys are like me when I was 16, right? They have no body fat at all. What that means is they can't actually survive the winter. They don't have enough energy reserves when there's no food in the water column, and they quite literally die. So you catch them at the end of the year, they look big, but they just don't make it. And so cold winters, actually amplify the amount of predators, the pollock, that actually are there to graze on the euphausids because they can survive the winters. Likely because they've got all the copepods and the euphausids, all that extra biomass to actually get, bulk up on, sort of like bears and berries before hibernation. And so when we think then, how does that energy flow through the ecosystem to what we call a survival anomaly? It is how many pollock actually make it to ultimately be reproductive age. Once you get above the summer temperature of about 9 degrees, the population will quite literally crash. And because they're just burning out as young, and therefore they never evolve, they never grow to be the adults. And so your population above 9 degrees actually just starts to collapse. And so that's a real problem when we start to think about what will the pollock fishery look like 10, 20 years from now? Right now, it is the world's single largest fishery. Will it be that way for the next 20 years? Maybe. Will it be after that? Who knows?
Did it collapse during one phase and
I'll show you in a minute. So I think it's actually the slide after this to highlight that point. And so this is just trying to tie, again, this cold pool to where fish, adult fish and juvenile fish will exist. The juveniles can go in there, they just don't like it very much. There we go. So to think now about what happens to the prey and the predator populations in the warm to cold period. So this is exactly the question you asked. When we start out in the warm period, this is all relative biomass, so they all start at 1. But, you know, the euphausids start to grow a little bit. They really take off once it gets cold. But the actual pollock numbers start to decrease because, again, they're burning out. They're not making it to the next year, so the overall population is declining. Once the water temperature changes and the sea ice starts to come again, you know, it bottoms out, and it takes several years for the population to start to recover, to start going in the same direction as you would expect because there's a lot of food for them to prey upon. And so the reason that is these are organisms with complex life cycles. They live several years, and so they integrate all of that variability, whereas things like copepods, euphausids, they're all much shorter lived. They don't have the history that the pollock do. And so it takes their populations a lot longer to turn around. So didn't really crash, but it did reduce by 40–50%. So another aspect of this, the seasonal sea ice and creating this cold pool and this temperature effect, is it actually creates foraging hotspots for certain macrofauna. So here, humpback whales, they really only look for a few euphausids and other prey items along the Aleutian Arc. The fin whale is further out on the shelf, heading up towards the Russian coast. Black-legged kittiwakes, a diving bird, they'll go anywhere. They're sort of like the seagulls of the Arctic. Thick-billed mewers, again, an even better diving bird. They tend to focus further out on the shelf where the populations of these copepods and euphausids and things like that are highest. And so this coming and going of warm and cold, of the cold pool actually will change just how far some of these organisms have to move, right? I mean, if you're a bird, these guys, they live on rocks. So they're going to be stuck here in the islands here off Bogoslav and a few other islands. If it's a warm year and all these population centers of their prey items are further north, they've now got to fly farther to get their food, which means they're burning more energy per unit they're gaining, which means they're much less healthy, which means their population is more prone to crash. It also forms foraging hotspots for humans as well. For me personally, one of the really, really neat parts of this project was they actually had a very large local and traditional knowledge component. And so it's interesting to talk to people who, for thousands of years, have hunted based upon which way the wind's blowing today or where they think that ice sheet is going. And so around the island of St. Lawrence Island, you've got one of the fishing villages called Savunga, and they know exactly where around the island and exactly when in a year they know to go to get whales or walruses or what have you for their subsistence living. And so St. Lawrence Island is right here at the mouth of the Bering Strait, and the reason that there's a lot of this productivity on the north side of the island is oftentimes there'll be a polynya, an open water space north of the island. And when you actually go and ask them, you know, how many walruses did you harvest this year or that year, they actually have data. They actually pay attention to these things. They keep track of these things. And so we can go back far further than we could as sort of traditional Western scientists just by talking to them and finding out what the ecosystem may have done 30, 40 years ago when their ancestors were out there fishing. And as a result, native peoples, all these villages, have a very regional perception of the ecosystem. They know the Bering Sea as a whole, but they know really well their part. And so there's 5 little villages that we talked to: Savunga, Amanek, St. Paul, Togiak, and Aquitaine. And they've all got different views of how their part of the Bering Sea is actually behaving over time. And so Savunga thinks things are going great, as is St. Paul, whereas Aquitaine and Amanek think things are sort of, average, middle of the road. But Togiak, they're a bit concerned because they think everything's declining. And so it really depends, in part, what they actually live on. What's their subsistence harvest? And so you don't need to necessarily see all the colors, but note that Savunga relies most heavily on marine mammals, walruses, whales, things like that, whereas everybody else, because they're pretty much on the mainland in a sense, they live much more on salmon and berries and other terrestrial animals. And so their sense is driven by what they need to survive. And so understanding what they need to survive becomes really important. And so that is how I think the mission of Bigelow actually fits into this project pretty well, because we're trying to understand the basic science of the system, but it's to understand a very practical educational question. And so I had put these slides in before I remembered that Ben was talking next week, so I will take the hit. This was a shameless plug for Ben's talk. But this is the Bering Sea. All of these solid lines and dotted lines, these are the currents of water that flow from the Pacific through the Bering Sea, whether it's along the shelf or along the the Russian coast, into the actual true Arctic and all of its coastal seas, the Chukchi Sea and the Beaufort Sea. And so thinking about what's happening in the Bering Sea will have an incredibly important impact on what's going to happen in the actual high Arctic, or the Arctic and the high Arctic in the future. And I think, and I would lobby, the only way we can actually understand that is by thinking about these programs at that holistic level, because you can't just measure one little thing in a box and actually expect to understand these incredibly complex systems. And so with that, I will take any questions on the biology part. What was that? So this is actually a humpback whale coming up in the middle of a seabird colony floating around on the water. So it's only in there because I wish I could have taken it, so I'm jealous.
How many species of fish are in the Alaskan fishery?
Sure. So the question was, how many species of fish are in the actual the Alaskan Bering Sea fishery? So the ones that we want to harvest, there's Pacific cod, there's pollock, there's one other one that I'm forgetting right now because I'm a phytoplankton person. There's a number of other species that they're finding that are actually coming up onto the shelf, like the arrowtooth flounder, which for right now is not actually a fishery, but it's having a pretty important impact because it's sort of the equivalent of the lionfish in tropical reefs, right? They're just sort of chewing its way through the ocean. Arrowtooth flounder, as their name would suggest, are doing a pretty awesome job of chowing down pollock.
The industry is supported by a very small number.
Yeah, it's basically supported by pollock, right? Walleye pollock is the world's single largest fishery. It is the single largest fishery in the Bering Sea, and there's two species that sort of contribute, but they're sort of down in that 5-10% of landings kind of thing.
To add to that, then, piggyback on that, on that graph when you showed the difficulty of the pollock to really regain their numbers in the colder years, how much, you suggested that it was their lifespan that was part of it, but how much is the fisheries, do you think, helping to keep that resurgence?
Right, so the question was what's the impact of the actual human fishery on the rebound of the pollock fishery in the Bering Sea? The Bering Sea fishery is amazingly well managed. It's actually, I would argue, better than the Gulf of Maine lobster fishery in terms of managed. Every year, NOAA's going out there and they're collecting every year a new stock estimate. That new stock estimate goes in and sets quotas for the following year. So it's not okay, you can harvest X for 10 years and then we'll look back at it. It's an every year they're going back. So while clearly there's a human impact, we're taking them out, but it's actively managed to try to keep it at what we think is a sustainable level. So I think most of that recovery really is the difference in the types of organisms as opposed to too much fishery pressure.
Were you able to use the natives data record to go further back than I think your graph had the 1930s? Like, were you able to
So the question was, were we able to use the local traditional knowledge records to go back beyond the 1930s? No, but I think part of that was just the time frame. You know, we chose to go back for about 50, 60 years because we knew we could do that for all these various villages in the length of the project. You know, we could go back further, I think, but we just didn't have time.
So abnormal weather systems, for example, El Nino that come up, it didn't seem like there was much of a real temperature difference of stuff coming up from the California coast and everything. So is that really that much of a player, or is it mainly the winds coming from Siberia and over the Arctic that create that temperature variation?
Right. So the question was, is it basically warm temperatures propagating from the south through the Aleutian Arc as associated with tropical instabilities, or is it polar winds and cold that's coming and driving the temperature dynamic? And it really is the latter, because the Aleutian Arc does a really, really wonderful job of actually blocking a lot of that. And so you've only got very certain parts of the current that make it through the passes in the Aleutian Arc. And so their volume relative to the volume moving backwards down to either through the Bering Strait or coming over from the Russian side in the Anadyr Current just swamp those. Mike? The question is, what is it about the underside of the ice that attracts phytoplankton to settle there? The disco lights. No, in all honesty, it probably actually is the fact that they at least get some light. It fixes them in a part of the water column where they get a little bit of light. If you look at the density structure under the ice, it's pretty uniform, which means they'll mix through basically from very little light to no light. So by sticking to the bottom of the ice, they don't get a lot of light, but at least it's a constant little bit of light.
The graph earlier, it said that since not sure if it's the phytoplankton, but certain species have like very little lifespans, and so they have temperature doesn't really affect them. They've got little effects up and down, and if the other fish have sort of longer lifespans, and they start to become less and less of them.
Mm-hmm.
And the other plankton or whatever is going down downtrend more slowly.
Mm-hmm.
The fish, and if the fish eat those organisms, plankton, if they eat that, then would the fish be able to go back to population? And would it kind of make, and since the plankton, those organisms go down again, so would it kind of level itself out?
Right. So the question is, so at the phytoplankton level, there's relatively small change warm to cold, but there's that large amplification at the higher trophic levels. And so the question is, can larger, like euphausiids and things like that, or pollock feed down on the plankton as a way to modify their population? And unfortunately, no. The phytoplankton are too small for them to eat. So really, it's the amount of energy that makes it up to the copepods and the euphausiids that they can live on. And so
When they grow, it kind of sort of itself out because they kind of have a longer lifespan as well. So
yeah, we can talk later.
I'm wondering if, as you look over the years of the cold cycles and the warm cycles and through the trophic layers, if you actually see or think you might see some evolutionary effects going on.
So the question is, as we look back through these warm-cold oscillations, do we see an evolution within the genome of pollock, or at any level. The answer is I don't know, because I don't think anyone's looked at it. I suspect it would be very difficult to be able to do that in pollock, because their lifespan's long enough. Our records probably don't go back enough to go through enough generations for those random mutations to build up. Even in the Arctic, phytoplankton will often divide once a day. So, those mutations can accumulate much, much quicker. So you might be able to see it, but I don't think anyone's actually looked at it in an evolutionary sense. Certain phytoplankton do better in cold, and certain phytoplankton do better in warm. So clearly there was an evolutionary step, but I don't know if it's sort of actively modifying itself.
Can you make any general assumption about Alaskan fisheries? Then you have global warming.
So the question is, can we make general assumptions about the Alaska fisheries if there's a little bit more warming? So based upon the data we do have, without continued active management of the pollock fishery, that the population, the total number of pollock living in the Bering Sea will in all likely go down. And since we know it's an actively managed fishery, the fishery's landing associated with pollock will go down. As I was alluding to a little bit earlier, there's another species called the arrow-toothed flounder, which has actually radically increased its biomass and distribution over the Bering Sea shelf over the last 3 decades. Right now, that's not a fishery species because we don't really know what to do with it per se. Will that take over as a new important fishery? Hard to say, but I think it is safe to say that if the system warms and stays warm, that the pollock fishery will not be as large then as it is now.
You mentioned the fishery is actively managed. Now, I'm assuming you're talking about the American fishery. So Chinese, Japanese, Russians that fish may be taking all they can possibly get, and that could, I would assume, have some adverse impact on pollock.
It does. We do get some information from foreign nations, their harvests. We don't have any real information from the Russian side of the Bering Sea. So productivity of phytoplankton is actually higher on the Russian side, but it looks like fisheries productivity is higher on the US side. So there's that dichotomy. And we don't get perfect records from foreign national vessels in US territorial waters and what they're taking, but they have a reasonably good idea, and so that's factored into the management. So.
You are a specialist in algae. So is algae a symptom of what changes are happening, or is it changing because of the changes in the ecosystem, larger ecosystem?
So the question is, sorry?
Some purpose.
Right. So the question is algae, is the presence of algae a symptom or a driver? And algae grow, and they're the base of every food web in the ocean or every food web in a lake at some level. And so in the Bering Sea, there's no, at least as of yet, there's no real negative consequences of the growth of algae. There's no real harmful algal blooms. We have growth of one particular organism. It's called a coccolithophorid, which is drawn right there. And when that blooms, it changes the flow of energy a little bit, but it's not toxic. It just muddies up the works a little bit. So in that sense, I don't think algae would be classified as a symptom, but they ultimately sort of set the mark for just how much energy and carbon there can be in the system. And if it's not grazed, will they continue? Will their diversity change? Will the good phytoplankton stop growing and bad phytoplankton start growing? Maybe. Hard to say.
To what extent does the sea ice act as like a conservation measure for pollock or whatever other species? Is it a good idea for us to start going into the polar regions to fish?
So the question was, does sea ice serve as a conservation measure? So let me make sure I understand what you mean by conservation measure. Okay, fair enough, okay. Perhaps. Sea ice is solid. It provides a structure. The algae will grow on it. The fish, until it actually melts back, you really don't get all of the growth of the other trophic levels. It's just simply too cold. The algae can do just fine, but the copepods, the euphausiids, the fish, they just go where it's not quite so cold. So I don't really think it would be a conservation measure per se. I mean, surely you're not going to fish where there's 6 feet of ice, but the pollock aren't going to be there either. So, Spencer?
Mike, the ice algae are fundamental to the well-being of the whole system. What happens to the quantity and the nutritional quality of the ice algae when the thickness of snow and ice in the Arctic Ocean decreases?
So the question is, given the central role of sea ice algae, how does their nutritional quality, and on how to go expand that to their physiological status, change as the thickness of ice and snow on top of the ice decrease, presumably in the future? Well, as the snow decreases and as the ice thins, they're going to get more light. They're going to grow faster, so they'll be physiologically more robust. Whether or not they will continue to produce the same fatty acids that actually make them nutritionally good, if the water's 2 degrees warmer, that's a matter of debate. I mean, there's actually a paper just came out, I don't know, maybe a week or so ago, or maybe a couple days ago, that argues that temperature has an interesting impact, an unpredictable impact on fatty acid concentration in cold water organisms. So where that threshold is hard to say, because you're also going to change which algae are there to some degree, right? Those long filaments that I was showing you, those are primarily Melisira. When those don't grow, you still get sea ice algae. It's just the Thalasseosaurus, Fragilaria and other ones like that. And so they fundamentally have different nutritional profiles. So, sure. Yeah. That the what?
That the sea ice, as the snow disappears from the surface of sea ice, so also the ice algae underneath the ice disappear.
So that's probably because they're melting out the bottom faster, I would guess. Melting out. Because as you start to get more light, that light is heat, right? So.
Could be photoinhibition, too much light.
Maybe. Definitely something that one could test.
For Mike? A lot of the questions about how phytoplankton will respond with less ice will also be stuff I'll talk about next week, just to whet your appetite a little bit for that. But we won't talk about the whales next week. Okay. Well, please join me in thanking Mike again, and thank you all for.
Out tonight.